welcome everyone. Thank you all for being here. My name is Keenan. I'm the chair of APRA, the Amsterdam Psychedelic Research Association. We are a non-profit academic association based here in Amsterdam with a focus on educating primarily students, but also researchers and other academics about developments in the area of psychedelic science. So we organize lectures like this one, journal clubs, symposia, all kind of centered around psychedelic science and altered states of consciousness research in general. We try to take an interdisciplinary approach doing this, so not just neuroscience, psychiatry, psychology, and medicine, but also the humanities like anthropology, philosophy, social sciences, and now very recently also political science. And that's the great thing about psychedelics. There's so many dimensions to it that you can investigate, and like a lot of enthusiasm has been there over the years, and a lot of interesting research coming out, but it's easy to forget sometimes that all these substances that we're discussing, like LSD, MDMA, psilocybin, are all Schedule I substances. They're all illegal, they're in the Opium Act, and they're considered non-medicinal, even though there's all this research coming out now suggesting exactly the opposite. So for those of you who are not members, you can join us. We only ask €10 a year, which is about 2 cappuccinos in Amsterdam, so I think that's a pretty good deal. I think Mathilde has our website somewhere, probably in the slides. And yeah, we're very glad to have Mathilde here. I met her very recently, and I saw her thesis online about psychedelics and moral panic. Right here. And I read it, and I thought it was not just saying that to flatter Mathilde, I thought it was a very, very thorough and interesting piece of research in a pretty underrepresented area of psychedelic science, like political science, even though it's super relevant and increasingly relevant as, you know, all these legislative developments are going on, reconsidering the scheduling of psychedelics. It's becoming more and more relevant to study the mechanisms of things such as moral panic, and how the history of the 60s and 70s is still kind of alive today, because I can tell you that even here at the UvA, even here in Amsterdam, there's still kind of these insidious stigmas and ideas about psychedelics that are still very dominant to this day. So without further ado, I want to give it to Mathilde. I'm very excited to hear her lecture, so let's all give her an applause.
Thorough introduction. You almost, don't need to give my lecture anymore. Welcome everyone. Like you said, my name is Mathilde. I don't know why I'm doing this introduction because you all know me basically, but I am super excited to stand here as the first political scientist giving a political talk for APRA. I wanted to give a short introduction about me as an academic. So I got my bachelor's in political science here in 2020. And I did my first master's in conflict resolution and governance, where I ran into the theory of moral panic for the first time. I did research into the Bhagwan movement in Central Oregon. I don't know if any of you have seen the documentary Wild Wild Country, perhaps, but I was able to interview Ma Anand Sheila, so one of the most important cult members, and really dive into the theory of moral panic and get to know it for the first time. And it's proved to me to be a lens through which I could look at a lot of social phenomena, and it's a very different approach to developments and conflict. So I really enjoyed that, and I did my master's in political communication last year, of course, and you guys probably want to know how I got into psychedelics, even though once again the majority of you already know. It happens when my very best friend Freek, who is sitting right there, gifted me this book for my 23rd birthday, and that is, of course, Food for the Gods by Terence McKenna. I'm sure a lot of you here have read it. It really opened my eyes to this whole kind of dramatic story in the US that I was previously unaware of. So for me, I was immediately hooked. I started reading a lot about psychedelics and listening to all these talks by Terence McKenna, Timothy Leary, you know, all these old iconic people, and I was hooked. And then I moved on to my second book, which proved to be the Bible for me personally, is How to Change Your Mind by Michael Pollan. As you can see, I used to take it everywhere, and I definitely used it for my thesis. Also a great book. If you haven't read it yet, highly recommend it. So I think the most important part was that this all happened in the summer of 2021. Yeah, right before I started my master's, my second master's. And I kind of knew that I immediately wanted to do some kind of psychedelic research, especially because, as Kaden already mentioned, there is a lot of new research happening right now, but the focus is predominantly on medical use, which is amazing and very inspiring. It also means that the field is broadening and there's a lot more space for different perspectives and interdisciplinary research into this iconic topic. So without further ado, in this lecture, I will first be discussing the theory of moral panic. Then I will go on to describe the psychedelic moral panic. Then there's time for a little break if you guys feel like it. And then I will be presenting my own research and moral panic within the UVA, and especially how to overcome them. Okay, so without further ado, what are moral panics? The theory was first introduced by Stanley Cohen in 1972, who described moral panics as a particular kind of social phenomenon where an issue, group, or behavior is perceived as a threat to the moral fabric of society. So morality plays a really big role in moral panics, as you guys will see over the course of this lecture. So in his book, he really focused on the role of the media and the authorities in amplifying certain social issues. And he described how the media and authorities in amplifying these social issues create a folk devil, which is based on deviance from the moral norm. So in his book, he looked at the 1970s UK setting where the mods and the rockers had a lot of young people listening to punk rock music. And this was seen as a huge problem, a moral problem, because it was seen as a threat to the moral fabric of society. And it ended up with the mods and the rockers, the youth, being blamed for a lot of society's problems, including juvenile delinquency and drug use. Music, right? We're talking about music here. And the sensationalism of the media, which is more specifically selective reporting, exaggeration, really led to the authorities taking drastic measures to curb this humongous threats of music, ending in really strict censorship laws and the banning of certain albums and songs, which is crazy to think about. And then we move on to Good and Ben Yehuda, the main scholars in my thesis. In 2009, they take a more social constructivist approach to the theory of moral panic. And they say it's not only the authorities and the media that play a big role in amplifying these concerns, it is also paired with a wider societal response. And according to Good and Ben Yehuda, moral panics can come up and erupt when a society faces a crisis or a perceived threat to its norms and values. And this can be anything ranging from rapid social change to a natural disaster to economic instability. Any type of friction in a society can lead to general feelings of anxiety, which are amplified by the media. Let me see. Of course, we go to the iconic 5 stages of moral panic. So they identify moral panics as going through a specific route map, basically. So it starts with concern, hostility, consensus, disproportionality, and it ends with volatility. So a concern means, just as Cohen said, a heightened level of concern about the behavior of a group of people and the consequence that their behavior presumably causes for society. That's a little for my neck. And then that leads to hostility against the group that is perceived to align themselves with the behavior or, do the behavior themselves. And in that hostility phase, you see the creation of the folk devil. You see that the media creates the difference between us, the good, decent, respectable folk, and them or the other, the deviants, bad, disreputable folk. So In this hostility stage, after the concern has been identified, you really see the morality of it come in, where the deviants are amoral and us, the good, reputable folk, the moral, great people who are threatened by the other people. And then a moral panic moves into a consensus, and this need not mean the entire society, but it needs to be widespread enough that a big group of people agree that the threat is real, serious, and caused by the wrongdoing group members and their behavior, which then leads to disproportionality, where the societal, legal, media, and political response are not proportional to the actual threat. And in this stage, the previous stages resulted in a lot of fear-mongering, which in this stage leads to institutionalization, so meaning the creation of laws and policies to curb the perceived threat, like, for example, the censorship laws in the UK. And Goodham and Yehuda also identify the fifth stage, volatility. They say that moral panics can erupt and subside quite quickly. And some of them leave no trace in our collective history. Others leave short-term change, like laws of fines or something that after a couple of years are no longer relevant and scratched, or long-term changes in law, social policy, or cultural norms and values, such as the classification of psychedelics as a Schedule I drug, which we'll get to later. I want to give another example because the theory of moral panic can be quite abstract. I think what we've been seeing in the US surrounding critical race theory is a really good example. So you see that people are really scared and the media is amplifying this problem as if it's the biggest problem that faces the country today, while there are many other problems, of course. And this leads to specific stories getting a lot of attention, which are usually based on inflated data, fear-mongering, a specific thing that's not really representative, but then the media pretends that this is, what everything is, and it leads to a lot of disproportional response with, for example, I did not prep this, I'm winging this one, but DeSantis, who is banning the books in the classrooms right now. I don't know if you guys are, knowing what I'm referring to, but
Roald Dahl.
Sorry?
Roald Dahl.
Roald Dahl. I mean, not really, but yes, absolutely. But so you can see a lot of multiple moral panics can be happening at the same time. It doesn't have to be one and only. There can be multiple happening. So. Now that we know what the theory of moral panic is, maybe there's a small moment for any questions that arise. Generally, if you have any questions, you can always just put up your hands. Flake.
Does the presence of a moral panic assume that the threat isn't real? Or can there be a moral panic surrounding an actual threat? Or is there always a level of
There's a big discussion about this actually within the theory of moral panic. We're on first name basis. Cohen and Goodham Ben Yehuda argue that it is always, a moral panic has to be disproportionate to the actual threat that it poses. And it has to be, it's kind of, how do I say this? The word panic implies that there is no rationale. And he has written multiple papers arguing why a moral panic should be called a moral panic, because he says, yes, in every moral panic there is a loss of rationale, because it's structurally an over-representation of the threat compared to what it actually is. Does that answer your question?
It does.
Yeah.
Thank you.
All right, so anyone else just, yes, Skinner.
Yeah, well, so the way it's described right now, that mechanism of moral panic is kind of independent of culture. So is this kind of considered a universal thing, like regardless of what kind of society or culture it's taking place in? This could also happen in Asia, Africa. Is this all just across the board something that is seen?
Yeah, I think so, and I think the moral panics change based on the place where they're located, because it really is about the perceived or the felt threat to the status quo. And no matter what status quo that is, that means that the deviance is gonna be adapted to the status quo of the location. So it's definitely possible that this happens in other countries as well. Yeah, for sure. Okay, the psychedelic moral panic. Now we can look at the progression of the entering of more like psychedelics in specifically U.S. society until the criminalization through a very different lens, which I think is really cool. So according to Good and Ben Yehuda, all telltale signs for a moral panic were present in the dealings of the US government with classic psychedelics. There was a big discussion about whether or not the psychedelics can be seen as a moral panic, especially because the theory of moral panic was created in 1972, so after the height of the moral panic and the criminalization in the Netherlands, for example, and in the US as well. But they say that all the telltale signs were stereotyping, exaggeration, distortion, and sensitization. And especially that sensitization of the media influences the credibility of the stereotyping, the exaggerations, and the distortions. And the sensitization actually leads to the belief among people like, sure, these are the sorts of things that LSD crazed people do, because we've gone through all of these stages already of the consensus that this is a problem, and all of the things that we've discussed earlier. So my favorite examples of this media sensitization are some of these actual headlines of the time. Newsweek said that the LSD, the mind-expanding drug that makes you go insane, let me just grab it real quick. The article claimed that LSD was the hottest, most potent, most dangerous drug in the world, and suggested that even a single dose could lead to permanent insanity. We got the National Enquirer, the horror of LSD, you may be next. The article claimed that LSD use could lead to horrible hallucinations and permanent insanity, and also suggested that anyone who even tried it once was putting themselves in grave danger. Time magazine said that LSD was the exploding threat of the mind drug that got out of control. And this article cited a study that, in which pregnant rabbits were given high doses of LSD, which led to deformation in their offspring. Relevant, very relevant. And then of course we got the Chicago Tribune, LSD, the acid that dissolves your mind, claiming that LSD attacks the very essence of your personality, and once again suggesting that even those who tried the drug once were at risk of developing long-term psychological problems. So we see here definitely a pattern. Don't try LSD or you will go absolutely insane. And I think the best example of how this kind of fear-mongering and sensitization and exaggeration and distortion can influence policy is the story of how LSD got criminalized in the Netherlands. Just a quick tally, who here knows the story of the criminalization of LSD in the Netherlands? Excellent, I know you guys read my thesis. So it is a really fun story. It's one of my favorite ones. When I learned about it, I was so shocked that this dramatic turn of events is not taught in school, to be honest. So a little bit of context. In the Netherlands in the mid-1960s, the counterculture movement of the US had fully arrived here, and there was a lot of social unrest. And the specific context for the criminalization of LSD in the Netherlands was the forthcoming marriage of the Queen Beatrix of the Netherlands with the German Claus von Amsbergen. And coming right out of the Second World War, the Dutch people were not very happy with the prospect of our head of state marrying a German. And especially because Klaus, as a German citizen, was a member of the NSDAP Jungvolk and the Hitlerjugend, so an active German in the Second World War, and he also served in the German army during the Second World War, as German citizens had to do. So this marriage, people were very against it, and there was a lot of protests in the streets. So you could see on municipality buildings orange swastikas being painted, and big sentences saying "Klaus raus," like "Get out, Klaus," or "Klaus, go back to your Heimat, go back to your home." people were not having it. And Provo is a protest group. Provo is short for provocative, basically, who usually played into the social unrest. And so they did with the forthcoming marriage. And what they did is they created their own Orange Committee, which is the original committee who creates or like organizes all of the royal events in every city. So they created a fake one, and they spread a rumor saying that on the date of the marriage, March 10th, 1966, the waters of the city of Amsterdam would be poisoned with LSD. And yes, that's the right response, laughter, because it's so dumb. And that police horses would be fed sugar cubes laced with LSD by unsuspected children. And it's a very old 1966, right? So it's barely legible. But for those who do speak Dutch, you will see that they even give some advice to the police and their horses. So if you notice that your horse has been fed LSD and it is, uncontrollable, it is best to immediately just kill it right then and there, because, that's unsalvageable and that's done. So this rumor was spread, and of course we now know that it is ridiculous, because how would people poison the water supply of Amsterdam? Where would they get the LSD? Why would they spend it on this, instead of just on themselves? How would they get children so far as to give LSD-laced sugar cubes to the horses? It makes no sense. But the Dutch cabinet thought otherwise. They were like, yes, this is completely credible, because these are the kinds of things that LSD-crazed people do. And within 5 days of this rumor being spread, all psychedelics were criminalized in the Netherlands. Crazy, right? Yes, okay, great. I mean, my favorite story, to be honest. So back to the US. Well, in 1966, LSD was criminalized here in the Netherlands. In 1970, also in the US, the disproportionality stage of the moral panic led to the criminalization of psychedelics. And the classification, as Kenan already mentioned, of psychedelics as a Schedule I drug, the same as heroin. And that also means a classification of a Schedule I drug that there is, it is recognized that there are no medical benefits to this drug, and it is not fit for medical use. So this, of course, had far-reaching legal implications, not only for the regular people who could suddenly face criminal charges, imprisonments, and insane fines. It also resulted in big implications for the research. There were no more grants. The National Institute of Mental Health pulled their grants and refused to support any new projects that were looking into the therapeutic benefits of psychedelics. And the infamous Harvard psilocybin project had to shut down. And the main problem in the research was that there was no more access to LSD, because before it was freely distributed for research purposes. And of course, it was illegal to have it and to do testing with it, which led to psychedelic research having to go dormant or underground, at least officially. We also know that there were still researchers who did continue to research the therapeutic benefits of psychedelics at grave personal risk. Let me see if I'm missing anything here. I think, let's see. I think that was it. So how would we feel about a small break before we move into my own research? Are people still, comfortable in their seats? Yeah? No one wants to smoke?
I mean, personally, we could go on.
Yeah?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm good.
All right. Consensus. Great, guys. Okay, so now it's time for my personal research, which I'm really excited to share with you guys. Obviously, learning about all this, I thought that this must have some impact on today's opinions of people towards psychedelics. Like, it's impossible that there was such a huge dramatization and sensitization, stereotypes, exaggeration, all of those things that people believed at the time. I thought it was impossible that all of those things left everyone's collective memory and people would be unbiased in their opinions towards psychedelics. So I set off to research just that. To do that, I created 2 research questions. So the first one was, to what extent does falling back on traditional moral panic rhetoric in campaigns influence citizens' electoral support compared to using neutral rhetoric? And to what extent is this process moderated by lifetime experience with classic psychedelics? And I was also interested in how someone's age influenced their opinions, considering a lot has changed over the years. So my second research question was, how does age moderate citizens' electoral support when being presented with traditional moral panic rhetoric? And how does lifetime experience with classic psychedelics influence this relationship? So for those who are interested in statistics, this is my design, or this was a visualization of my 5x3x2 quasi-experimental experiment to research the effects of the independent variable moral panic rhetoric on respondents' electoral support, which is the dependent variable. If you don't like statistics, ignore this. So to answer especially my first research question, I came up with 2 hypotheses. The first one was, for those who have lifetime experience with classic psychedelics, being presented with traditional moral panic rhetoric will lead to lower electoral support than not being presented with traditional moral panic rhetoric. This makes sense, at least to me it made sense, because experience with these drugs, in my experience, leads to a better ability to recognize the stereotypes, and you kind of just know that it's bullshit, to be honest. And so for the second hypothesis, I was interested in the behavior of the people without lifetime experience. So I thought that being presented with traditional moral panic rhetoric will lead to a higher electoral support than not being presented with traditional moral panic rhetoric. I was really under the impression that if you don't have experience with psychedelics, you're way more vulnerable to fall for the fear-mongering, because it's such an ungraspable concept. And we all collectively know what happened in the 1960s and 70s. And if you don't do your research, you may believe what you've been told. So that was my expectation. And to kind of visualize it a little bit better, we have the independent variable, the moral panic rhetoric, and its effect on respondents' electoral support. And I was interested in hypothesis 1A, is lifetime experience with classic psychedelics. What kind of influence does that have? And my second research question is the influence of age. And then I wanted to be fancy and do a 3-way interaction model. So I also looked at the lifetime experience and its influence on the relationship between age as a moderator. Does this make sense? Yeah? Okay, good. So for my methodology, I interpreted the theory of moral panic as described by Good and Ben Yehuda as a hierarchical scale, meaning that they build on top of each other, and one cannot exist without the other. So if you ask me, a disproportional response, a legal, societal, cultural response, cannot exist without concern about said thing that they're making laws about, right? So the theory to me implied that it could be seen as a hierarchy. And what I did here, this is a visualization of my experiment. So I have a neutral condition, which of course is the control condition in any experiment. And then I manipulated moral panic in 4 phases. I decided to leave the volatility stage because it's not a communication strategy, and as a communication major, I had to focus on communications. I'll get to that a little bit later also. So I let go of the volatility stage, and I operationalized moral panic as consisting of concern, hostility consisting of concern and hostility, consensus and disproportionality. So I wrote a cue for every stage of the moral panic, and I ended up making campaign clips which varied in the extent of the moral panic. So I found a journalist who was crazy enough to spread some misinformation about psychedelics for me. And what I did is I made them in Dutch and in English, because I believe that Dutch people being presented with an English politician would never vote for him, so that would influence the results of the electoral support. So I found a journalist who is American and who has lived here for over 20 years, so he spoke Dutch and English, so he was kind enough to do both of my audios. And I thought that you guys would enjoy seeing them because I think they're hilarious and I'm really proud of them. So let's start with the neutral one, which is the control clip. And let's see if this works. No sound. Wait. Anyone have experience with how to get the sound to work?
Zit er niet zo'n knoppen voor meestal achter?
Achter mij.
Als ik
Oh,
aan...
ja? Oh, wacht. Even aan. Ik
Gaat
heb
het een beetje goed gaan?
hele goede. Sorry guys, 1 second. I think this one maybe. Heel goed.
Yes.
Okay, excellent.
Very
Let's
nice.
start again. So keep in mind this is supposed to be neutral.
A few psychoactive drugs are also known as classic psychedelics. These drugs change your perception. You see, hear, or feel things differently than they truly are. Psychedelics are used recreationally, but recently published research indicates that there could be benefits to using psychedelics in mental health care. Some scientists say the results are promising, but others have their doubts. It's expected that within 5 to 7 years, psychedelics could be approved for medical use. There are pros and cons to using psychedelics in our healthcare, and we need to assess those first before we can make a choice. That's why I'm calling for a broad societal discussion of the potential use of classic psychedelics in our national healthcare system.
So this is Robert, my fake politician. In real life, he's also named Robert, so that's pretty funny. But I thought I'd also show you guys the disproportional stage. Keep in mind, there's a concern video, a hostility, and a consensus before this. But this includes all the cues of a moral panic. It had to be at least a little bit believable, so it could have been way crazier, but this is what I came up with.
It's expected that within 5 to 7 years, psychedelics could be approved for medical use. But we don't know enough about the effects. In the United States, federally funded research has only been conducted since 2021. We should not introduce new drugs like these in our national healthcare system. Administering psychedelic drugs, which make you hallucinate, is dangerous for people who are mentally unstable. Between 17 and 20% of young people admit to having used psychedelics recreationally, and a substantial part of this group becomes addicted. Every year, dozens of people die because of psychedelics. Some are killed by accidents caused by hallucinations. Others are so horrified by their experience that they decide to end their own life. Besides, the government should have no part in encouraging people to take hallucinogenic drugs. After all, history teaches us that taking psychedelics motivates people to oppose the status quo. Surveys show that a substantial number of voters share my concerns and have their own doubts about this. That's why I'm calling for a broad societal discussion of the potential use of classic psychedelics in our national healthcare system.
Okay. I hope that you guys could recognize the different stages of the moral panic. So the concern, the hostility, the consensus, everyone agrees with me, and then of course the inflated data. 0.1% or something of US population has tried psychedelics, and maybe 1%, not 0.1. Sorry guys. But no way in that there are 17 to 20% of youth trying it and people becoming addicted, because we know
And suicide.
right, and suicidal.
Yeah.
We know the research is actually proving the opposite, and we know that psychedelics are not addictive. We're getting to the ethnography stage already. Let me just check real quick if I'm missing anything. Yeah, so as I said, the surveys were created in English and in Dutch to make sure that everyone could join and people would not be, everyone could join. Let's keep it at that. So before my survey was done, before it was launched, I sent it to my thesis supervisor who approved it. And I made the videos, everything was ready to be launched. And then I thought it was time to do a little bit of ethnography. Yeah?
Yeah.
Wow. So I thought that it was time, after diving into psychedelics in July of 2021, this was March 2022, to try psychedelics for the very first time. Because I really wanted to know if my survey was really asking the right questions, and I felt like I was ready because I had done a lot of research, and going into this trip, or coming out of this trip, I immediately knew that no, my questions were not completely or complete enough to ask the right questions, which for me was super interesting because I thought that I knew everything that you could know about these drugs, minus the experience of trying them, because I'd done so much research. But yeah, I included the ego dissolution inventory as operationalized by Noor et al. And these included questions to measure the intensity of one's trip, which I immediately knew would influence someone's response to the moral panic rhetoric. And in my sample, you see that people didn't have the strongest trip because it was ranging from 0 to 10. And the ego dissolution mean score was only 3.8. So that's not very, very high, but you know, it's a fair amount of ego dissolution. I also included the post-psychedelic quality of life scale as operationalized by Barrett et al., which ranged from -3 to +3 to see what the after effects were of people's psychedelic experiences. And here you can see, I was pleasantly surprised. People reported a great post-psychedelic quality of life. So a 1.8 out of 3 in positivity, I think that is insanely high. So a little bit more about my sample. As you can see, people with lifetime experience in classic psychedelics were greatly overrepresented. I spread my survey online, and I wanted to make sure that my survey was kind of balanced, or at least my sample was balanced in the sense that not one group would be hugely overrepresented. Unfortunately, there's always a bit of self-selection. People who don't like psychedelics and have no lifetime experience with psychedelics won't be super interested in participating in this research. And as I said before, there's a big gap in the scholarship of psychedelic research when it comes to political psychedelic research. So I received so much enthusiasm from the psychedelic community, and everyone was sending it around, everyone wanted to participate, everyone was hyped. So you can see an overrepresentation of 67, like 2/3 of my sample having tried psychedelics. And overall it was also strongly leftist, with ranging 0 as being extremely leftist and 10 as far right. And I even...
Surprise.
Surprise. Well, I recently, when this all was happening, I had a great talk with Paloma. Paloma used to be the head of research and development department within APRA. And I was talking to her about this research and my expectation, or you know, the now debunked stereotype that these psychedelics make you leftist. She told me that during the January 6th Capitol attacks in the US, I don't know if you guys remember that photo of that dude with like this, this Viking hat on in the middle of the speaker's chamber. He is a psychedelic shaman. So it's kind of messed up, but so the idea that psychedelics make you left-wing is not true. There's just a hugely selection bias in all the research that is happening. So to counter this, I posted in pro-Trump groups, I posted in Forum for Democracy groups, I posted in like strongly religious groups. I really tried to look for this untapped group of people. I tried. So the construction of variables is not super interesting, but you can see that in general, the electoral support for Roberts was not very high on a scale of 1 to 10. So people really didn't like him for various reasons, probably because he was spreading misinformation. And the lifetime experience with classic psychedelics, I coded by using this question. This is taken from Noor et al. As well. And you can see the makeup of the sample here. If I were to do this research again, I would really tackle this group differently, the yes only once group. I would love to hear about their psychedelic experience to see if I should still classify them as having psychedelic experience, because I know a lot of people who have tried psychedelics didn't get the result that they wanted, and if that is your only experience, then I truly question if I can code you as having lifetime experience based on, you know, my hypothesis for what that does to you. So now we get to the really vague. Okay, I'll just give it to you guys because it's a really useful little thing. The construction of my age variable was based on socialization theory and the three biggest moments in psychedelic. You can just look at it and pass around. The moments in psychedelic history. What I wanted to do is I wanted to create 3 age groups.
Maybe you can draw on the
Oh,
whiteboard.
you're so smart. Okay, then I'll use this one just for the numbers. That is great. So I created the first group as being socialized during the moral panic. And socialization theory states that you get socialized into opinions about drugs when you're about 10 years old. Considering the idea that people above 90 probably wouldn't really do my survey, we start this group as being born in 1932. And then we go to the legacy group. So these people were socialized as soon as psychedelics got criminalized and institutionalized, and that happened with the CSA group, the passage of the Controlled Substances Act in 1971 in the US, and being socialized when you're 10. That starts with people being born in 1961. And then we have the Renaissance group. In 2006, it is said that the psychedelic renaissance has started because 3 important things happened in the same year. First of all, Albert Hofmann, the researcher who synthesized LSD, turned 100 years old. And to celebrate, there was a 3-day symposium held in Basel. This man was still alive and attended, as well as about 2,000 psychedelic enthusiasts, researchers, therapists, psychonauts, everyone who was interested in psychedelics. And this was received hugely positively, and people were kind of shocked at this change of perception towards psychedelics already. And what also happened was that the Supreme Court of the United States decided that legally Native communities had a right to import ayahuasca into the US based on the Religious Freedom Act. Actually, I'm not sure if it was Native communities or other religious groups. I will look that up later. But so this meant that there was a steady import of a psychedelic which was approved by the Supreme Court into the US, which is also a huge change from 1971. And the last thing was the publication of the very first rigorous, double-blind, peer-reviewed and controlled research paper by Griffiths that claimed that psychedelics could occasion mystical and religious epiphanies in people. So all of this happened in 2006, meaning that people who were socialized 10 years before were born in 1996. So that made it look like this. And then because out of ethical reasons, you're not allowed to ask people about drug use that are under 18, 2004 is the final date in my age groups. And then unsurprisingly, the sample of the oldest groups was for sure the smallest, with only 80 participants. The legacy group was really big, with 555 respondents filling in my survey. And then we had the Renaissance group with also a huge sample of 484 respondents, which comes together after data cleaning to 1,119 respondents. A big enough group to actually do some statistical testing. So that was hugely exciting to me. Yep, visualization. And an important side note here is that since my research has been published, I've been made aware of the colonial roots of the term psychedelic renaissance. And I think it's important to note that this implies that the criminalization and especially the resurgence of interest in psychedelics is something that primarily concerns Western countries. And this completely ignores the fact that native and other groups and researchers have been consistently researching psychedelics, have also, way before it reached Western countries, using psychedelics, have been seeing the cultural significance of psychedelics, and during the dormancy of psychedelic research in Western countries, have also continued doing research and continue to promote the psychedelic benefits, basically, that therapeutic use can have. Because a lot of these next slides contain screenshots from my thesis, I could not change the terminology, but I would say that better terminology to use in the future would be the current interest in the resurgence of psychedelic science or something of the sort. Just wanted to make sure that that was noted. So, results and limitations. I was under the impression that there would be something in these slides. Give me 1 second, guys. Oh, I think it's the internet. Let me try hotspotting myself real quick. Otherwise, it's gonna be real hard for you guys to follow if I just start. There we go. Let me just reload this. We've come a long way, guys. Oh, also in HD. There we go. I should have known that was when the internet blanked. Okay, so this is for people who like statistics. You can go back and look at them a little bit clearer. But I think the most important detail here is that, in general, for everyone in my sample, so the 1,100 people, being presented with the moral panic compared to neutral rhetoric led to an insane decrease in voting expectations. So for every step of moral panic, on average, people's electoral support went down with 0.7 on a scale of 1 to 10. So that's almost like between half a point and a full point. So that is a big thing. What is interesting here is that I researched the effect of lifetime experience. So that means that there are two different groups. The results were ran for people with lifetime experience and no lifetime experience. And what you can see here is the p-value is 0.000. So this is very strongly statistically significant. And it is hugely interesting to me that for the people who have no lifetime experience with classic psychedelics, being presented with the moral panic, 1, 2, 3, doesn't matter, one step on the moral panic scale, compared to neutral, leads to a decrease of 0.4 in voting probability. But for people with lifetime experience, that negative effect is more than twice as strong, which is hugely interesting because there's clearly a difference. Using these drugs clearly helps the, what I'm trying to say is that doing these drugs means that you perceive the moral panic differently. And you're like, no, this is actual fake news, and this is not true. And you respond way stronger to the manipulation than people without lifetime experience. So to visualize that, we have the estimated marginal means of voting probability. So this is not a visualization of the regression. This is just the mean scores of people indicating in each group what they think. And you can see here that people with lifetime experience, difficult colors, green and blue, look way too much alike, but the people with lifetime experience are right here. So in the neutral, their voting probability ranges between a 6 and a 7. And for the people without, they're even in the neutral, where he doesn't give any advice, he just says, we don't know, more research and then we can talk. The general like indication if they would vote is already way lower. But as soon as they get presented with any of the moral panic, it just dips an insane amount. So clearly people are not liking the classical moral panic rhetoric surrounding psychedelics. And so for age, once again, this is for the people who really like statistics. What I think here is relevant is this screenshot shows the comparison of the legacy group with the moral panic group and the Renaissance group with the moral panic group. So that's how regression works. So what you can see here is for the neutral condition, people who are in the legacy group compared to the moral panic group score 1.7 points higher in their voting probability. So they're already way more open to research and a conversation about psychedelics than the people in the moral panic group. And that difference is even bigger for the Renaissance group. So compared to the moral panic age group, for the neutral condition, they give an indication of their voting probability as 2.1 points higher than the moral panic group. So you see, what you see here is that in general, the age comes with more openness to this topic. And here we see a couple of interesting things. The conditional effects for electoral support for groups based on age. We see here that the most negative curve is for the legacy group. So they appear to respond most negatively to the moral panic rhetoric. And it's not a super huge difference with psychedelic Renaissance. They're also pretty negative, but the legacy group definitely responds the strongest. What we see here with the moral panic group requires some explanation. So first of all, the p-value is extremely high, meaning it is not statistically significant. And also the estimate is basically zero. So that makes total sense when we look at this graph. We see here something super interesting. So this moral panic group, I can see it better on my screen, is this bottom one, the blue one. So in the control group, we know they're quite negative. Their support dips for concern, goes lower for hostility, but as soon as the moral panic increases, so does their voting probability. So it turns into a U-shape with people in the disproportionality group almost being more positive than the people in the control condition. It implies a nonlinear relationship, and of course, because this is so close to that, makes total sense that the difference is basically zero. And it also makes sense that the p-value is so high because you cannot model a nonlinear regression with a linear regression. So this is a super interesting curve that I wish I could say more about, but more research needs to be done clearly to understand why these people love all these stereotypes so much. I think it is possible that they get triggered with, their memory gets triggered using the same stereotypes of the time, and that then their brain responds with a fear indication leading to higher voting probability because, of course, Robert said that no, we do not want these drugs in our medical healthcare. So, of course, that's attractive for people who are really scared and believe everything that he's saying. The three-way interaction model, if we go back, the lifetime experience on age was not statistically significant. So we cannot say with certainty that lifetime experience moderates the moderating effect of age on the relationship between moral panic and voting probability. But the estimate, the conditional effects definitely give us an insight into the relationship anyway. So for the reasons as discussed earlier, the moral panic group is not statistically significant. The sample is also too small with only 80 respondents. But still, we see here in every single group a difference. And the conditional effects for the Renaissance group and the legacy group are all statistically significant, meaning that there is a difference between these groups, between if they have lifetime experience or no lifetime experience. but the overall effect is not statistically significant on the relationship. But once again, we see here that lifetime experience with classic psychedelics changes everything. It means that you just completely look at the stereotypes, the information completely different, and it almost results in a backlash effect of negative campaigning, where the campaigner is actually punished for the misinformation that this person is spreading. So once again, this calls for more research. What is it that makes the difference between people with lifetime experience and no lifetime experience so big? Like, what is it about the information that we have surrounding psychedelics that differs so much clearly from taking them yourself? I find it wildly fascinating, and I would love to do more research into that. I think what is always important to keep in mind when discussing research are the limitations. So, of course, the nonlinear relationship with the moral panic group calls for more research. We don't know why they're so happy when they get presented with all these negative stereotypes. We have an idea, of course, but you need to know it before you can say that it's true. Also important to keep in mind is that my research did not pass the manipulation check. And for those who don't know, a manipulation check is a question in your research measuring if respondents actually perceive your manipulation the way that it was intended. So for me, I wanted to know if people in the different conditions, so the neutral group, the hostility group, the consensus, etc., if they responded significantly different to the amount, to the question, how much panic is Robert exhibiting? So they did not differ significantly from each other in each condition. So what that tells us is that the manipulation was probably not strong enough, or it is not possible to interpret the moral panic theory as a hierarchical scale after all, or my manipulation should have been made differently. The way to do it is not through a campaign clip. Like, because my research is the very first attempt at operationalizing the theory of moral panic, it just comes with many more questions, and my research is just the first step in many more before we can even answer these questions. But the most important conclusions is that the legacy group gets triggered most negatively when we're talking about age to the moral panic. So those are the people who were socialized, thank you, Jijke, during the time that, of course, it wasn't the height of the moral panic, but it was a result of the height of the moral panic. So, yeah, these people grew up thinking that psychedelics are just as dangerous as heroin and all of these other controlled substances. And my advice to politicians based on my research would be stay away from traditional moral panic rhetoric because people don't like it. And it appears that the times have changed enough to actually open the floor for research-based discussion. And we've seen it recently with our Minister of Health being super open to having a discussion and research done into the medical uses of psychedelics, and actually trying to and striving to be the #1 country in psychedelic research. So that is completely different than what I expected in the beginning. And of course, as I've already talked about the implications, like what does it mean that the difference between people with lifetime experience and without is so big? I wonder what it is that makes the difference so big. So I would love to do more research into this. And now we can all breathe out because we've gone through all the statistics and we don't need to worry about that anymore. And now I kind of have a juicy story to share with you. So as you all know, I did end up doing this research, but it was not because my supervisor was so enthusiastic about it. When I came to him saying that I wanted to do moral panic research and that the case study that I wanted to use was psychedelics, he actually tried to get me to change my topic. He told me that the way that stuff goes in the UvA is that when supervisors are presented with controversial research ideas from students, these research proposals must go to the UvA lawyer to see if there are any implications for the UvA if a student does controversial research. And he said, indeed, that he would have to give my research to the lawyer, but he also warned me that if he did that, he was fairly certain that my research would get rejected. So that is why he tried to get me to do this research about moral panic into abortion, into gay rights, into ableism, all of these other social, really interesting things, but not what I wanted to do. I wanted to do psychedelic research. So I thought about it for a long time, and I realized that it actually made me quite mad to realize that a liberal and left-wing progressive education institution was practicing such censorship on their students. And at the same time, it motivated me even more, because what more of a pointing case is this, that there is a moral panic that still has ramifications to this day? Because why is it controversial to research the effects of something in the past right now? How is that controversial? It is simply the fact that it is about psychedelics that scares, or about drugs that scares the UvA apparently. So I held my ground and I went back to my thesis supervisor and I said that I understood what he meant, but that I desperately wanted to do psychedelic research. So he agreed with me. He was like, okay, if this is what you want, sure, go ahead, but I cannot help you with the content of psychedelics, which makes sense because he is a researcher for political communication. I don't expect all supervisors to be at home in psychedelics as I am now. But had I not done a previous thesis for a previous master's or for my bachelor's, I would have probably been quite intimidated by the fact that my supervisor said, hey, if this is what you want to do, sure, but I can't help you. But luckily, that's where APRA comes in, because I knew of APRA and I reached out to APRA to help me embed my research into existing psychedelic research, because I was such a newbie, and they helped me immensely. So Paloma set up a couple of meetings with me and she sent me a lot of literature. She helped me pick my topic, honestly. She helped me with picking what falls within your topic and especially what doesn't. And without her, my research would not be here right now because I was so new to the field. So what I would do, what advice I would give to young students interested in psychedelics, wanting to do interdisciplinary research, we all know that UvA loves interdisciplinary research, so definitely promote your research design as being interdisciplinary. UvA loves it. And of course, stand your ground, because we all know that if you don't do your thesis about something that you're passionate about, it's going to be a really tough project. And use APRA as a resource. Become a member, reach out to people working there, and sometimes it feels like I'm living there,
yeah.
right? Reach out to the people and you'll be surprised at how much willingness there is to inspire young researchers to follow their passion and remain inspired. I think that is one of the most important things. And APRA is actually, we're looking into creating a thesis supervision group where not as official supervisors, but as supervisors who can fill that gap between the UvA, your supervisor and your research to help you do the psychedelic research that is so necessary in this time. So remain inspired and listen to your passion, become a member of APRA and do psychedelic research because it is more than necessary. Thank you so much. Awesome. Thank you guys. You're so nice.